The first frost of October had silvered the lane to Hartcombe Court the morning the county decided, all at once and with great satisfaction, that they had finally caught the Earl of Wenford in his lie, and they had been waiting 4 years for it. A carriage had come up from Towbourne after dark, they said, and a woman had been carried into the east wing with her face wrapped in linen, and the windows of that wing had not been unshuttered since. The story arranged itself in the parlors of Dunsley as neatly as a hand of cards. He kept a madwoman there. He kept a stranger there. He kept a wife he was ashamed of. And the shame had a shape. And the shape had a face. And the face was the thing he would not let them see. Rosanna heard them before she saw them. She was standing just inside the long window of that very east wing, behind the gauze of the inner curtain, where the cold came through the old glass, and settled at her wrists, and she watched 2 of the Dunsley women pause at the foot of the lane, and look up at the shuttered rooms and lean their heads together. She knew exactly what they said. She had heard it carried to her second hand through 4 long winters, in the careful silences of the servants, in the way the rector's wife would not quite meet her eye on the rare evenings she came down. She pressed her gloved hand flat against the cold pane, and held her breath until her heartbeat steadied in her throat, and she did not move until the women had gone on toward the village. What the county did not know was that the woman behind the shutters had asked to be hidden. They had built their whole bright, cruel story on the certainty that no woman would choose it. She was 26 that autumn, though she felt older in the mornings, when the right side of her face was stiff with cold, and the scarring along her cheek and jaw drew tight as a glove that had shrunk in the wash. She had been counted handsome once in the modest way of a clergyman's daughter with a good complexion and a steady eye, and she did not waste much grief now on the loss of being looked at. She grieved other things. She grieved the sound of her own voice in a full room. She grieved the particular weight of a hand on her arm at a dance, the press of company, the ordinary traffic of being a person among persons. She had married into all of it, and then by her own steady choosing, she had walked back out of it and pulled the door shut behind her. She had not always lived in the East Wing. 4 years before, she had come to Hartcombe Court as a bride. Plainly dressed and plainly delighted, the daughter of the late curate of Dunsley, married for love and against every prudent voice in the family, of the man who loved her. Felix had not cared what they said. That was the first thing she had understood about him, standing at the rail of a little stone church while his aunt sat rigid in the front pew with her mouth pressed white. He did not care what a room had decided. He looked at the actual person in front of him and made up his own mind, and the room could go hang. She had loved him for it before. She had finished loving anything else about him, and she had thought, in the foolish certainty of her first married summer, that nothing the world could do would ever frighten her again. She had been wrong about that, but not in the way the county imagined. The fire had come in the spring of her 2nd year, in the small hours, in the nursery at the top of the east stair. She remembered it now only in pieces, the way one remembers a thing the body has agreed to keep and the mind has agreed to set down. She remembered the smell first, sweetish and wrong. She remembered the heat of the latch under her bare palm, and choosing to take hold of it anyway. She remembered going in low along the floor where the air was, and she remembered the weight of the child she carried out, and she remembered the burning length of curtain that came down across the right side of her as she turned, and after that she remembered very little for a long while. The county told this part wrong, too. When they told it at all, they said she had been disfigured by a pox, by a wasting illness, by some shameful private thing. They could not have borne the truth, which was simpler and harder and had no shame in it whatsoever. She had walked into a burning room on purpose and walked out marked, and the mark was the cost of the only thing she had ever done that she did not regret. The child had lived. That was the fact she set against everything. The child had lived and grown and was 4 years old now and laughing somewhere in the warm front rooms where the morning sun came in, kept carefully apart from the cold east wing, not because the wing was a prison, but because Rosanna herself had asked that it be so. She would not have her scars be the first thing a small face learned to flinch from. She had decided that, lying in the long fever, afterward, with her own breath rattling and the surgeon murmuring over her, and she had held to it ever since with the particular stubbornness her husband had once loved, and now, she feared, had simply learned to endure. If Rosanna's choosing moves you, stay a while. There is more to it than the county ever guessed, and the woman they pitied was the strongest person in the house. It had been her idea to withdraw. That was the thing she could never make the world understand, and after a time she had stopped trying. In the months after the fire, when the dressings came off and she first saw clearly what the flame had done, she had looked at her husband, looking at her, and she had seen him school his face to gentleness, and she had not been able to bear it. Not the scars, the kindness laid over the shock. She had told him she would keep to the East Wing. She had told him she would not go down to dinners, would not stand at his side in the county, would not be the marred wife dragged out for the neighbors to study and the neighbors' charity to settle upon. She had told him she would rather be a rumor than a spectacle, and a rumor, she had thought, would at least leave him his consequence in the county intact. He had argued. She had won, because she always won the arguments that mattered to her, and because he had been too newly frightened of losing her to refuse her anything. And so the shutters had gone up, and the story had begun, and ever since she had let the county believe whatever cruel thing pleased it best, because the truth belonged to her, and she would not give it to them to handle. What she had not understood, in the proud safety of that choosing, was what her absence would cost him. She understood it now. She understood it because of the Dowager Lady Harrowgate, who had arrived at Hartcombe Court the week before the first frost, and had not the smallest intention of leaving. The Dowager was Felix's aunt by his late mother's side, a woman of 60, with a straight back and soft hands and a voice like cool water poured slow, and she had passed 4 years at a tasteful distance, writing letters of concern. Now, she had come in person, and Rosanna had understood, the moment she heard the wheels on the gravel, that something had shifted. The Dowager did not come for nothing. She came down to the shuttered rooms herself, on the second day, which no one ever did, and she sat in the cold little parlor in her good traveling pelisse, and she looked at Rosanna's face with a long, frank, measuring attention that was almost a relief after years of averted eyes. And then she said the thing she had come to say. "You have been very brave, my dear," she said, and her hands were folded and still. "But bravery is not the same as use. The county believes my nephew keeps a poor mad creature in his east rooms. They have believed it for 4 years, because you have let them. And a man cannot sit forever in a house. The county will not enter. There is a girl, a very good girl, of excellent family, who has been all this while uncommonly patient. It would be a great kindness in you to let him be free." Rosanna had heard the dismissive label 100 times second-hand. She had never before heard it spoken to her face, in a kind voice, in her own parlor, as a kindness. A mad thing kept in the dark. She held very still and felt her own heart go hard and bright as the frost on the glass. "He is not unfree," Rosanna said. "He has a wife." "He has a rumor," said the Dowager gently. "You said it yourself, I am told. You would rather be a rumor. Well, a rumor can be set aside far more easily than a wife, and I think you are clever enough to have always known it." She rose, smoothing her gloves. "There are ways. A marriage so circumstanced, a wife so withdrawn, a question of the mind. The bishops are reasonable men. I do not say it to wound you. I say it because someone in this house must be practical. And it has plainly never been you, and it has never been him." She went out, and her step on the cold stair was even and unhurried, and Rosanna stood alone in the little parlor, and understood for the first time, fully, what she had built. She had wanted to spare him. She had given the county a story instead, and the story had a use now, and the Dowager had found it. The very rumor Rosanna had chosen as a shield had been picked up and turned, and the woman who held it meant to cut the marriage out of him with it as cleanly as a surgeon. That night, she did something she had not done in 4 years. She wrote to her husband and asked him to come to the East Wing. He came after the house was dark, the way she had asked. A single candle in his hand, and he stood in the doorway of her cold parlor as though he had forgotten he was allowed in. Felix was 34 that year, tall and spare and dark, with a still face that the county read as coldness, and that she had learned in her married summer to read as the opposite. A man holding himself level over deep water. There was gray at his temple now that had not been there 4 years ago. She had put it there. She knew that. And the knowing was its own kind of fire. "Your aunt has spoken to me," she said. She did not soften it. "She means to have the marriage set aside. She has found you a girl." He set the candle down. For a moment he did not speak at all, and she watched the muscle move, once in his jaw, the small betrayal she had always been able to read in him. "Miss Corbridge," he said at last, his voice low. "Yes, I am aware. I have refused. You cannot keep refusing. Not if she takes it to the bishops. Not if the county swears I am mad. They will swear it, Felix. They have practiced the lie for 4 years. They will not even feel that they are lying." She heard her own voice climb and brought it down. "I did this. I gave them the story. I thought I was protecting you. And instead, I have handed your aunt the knife." He crossed the room then. He did not touch her, but he came near enough that she could see his face by the one candle. And what was in it was not the school gentleness she had fled 4 years ago. It was something rawer and older. "You did not hand her anything," he said. "She would have come at us with whatever she found. There has always been a Miss Corbridge waiting. There has always been an aunt with a practical face." He looked at the scarred side of her face openly, without the careful blankness, and he did not flinch, and she made herself bear it. "I have never once been ashamed of you," he said, the words level and slow. "Not for a single hour. You decided I was, and you decided it in a fever. And I have let you keep the decision, because I was afraid of losing what little of you I still had. That was my cowardice. It was never my shame." She had no answer to that. She had built 4 years on the certainty that he must, underneath everything, be relieved that she had spared him the sight of her in his world. To have it taken away left her standing on nothing. "Come down," he said. "Come down to dinner. Let them see you. Let them see what they have been lying about, and give them a spectacle instead of a rumor." Her voice shook. "No, I cannot." "Then she will win," he said simply, and took up his candle, and left her with the cold and the frost and the long, unanswerable truth that the only shield she still held was the one that would be used to destroy him. The dowager did not wait. This was what Rosanna learned about Lady Harrogate in the weeks that followed. She was not a woman who threatened and then sat back to let a threat work. She acted. Within a fortnight, Miss Letitia Corbridge had been installed as a guest at Hardcombe Court. A slim, fair young woman of 22, with a pretty anxious manner and very fine eyes, who had been told her whole life that she was the correct and sensible choice for some good man, and had arrived believing the man was found. Rosanna did not blame the girl. She watched her once from the gallery window, walking the frost-stiff garden on the dowager's arm, and saw a young woman doing exactly what she had been raised and instructed and flattered into doing, and felt no anger toward her at all. The anger she kept for the woman whose arm she walked on, and the dowager built her case. Rosanna learned the shape of it, slowly, the way one learns of weather coming from the steward Hollesley's grave, careful face, and from Mrs. Gadd Pelham, the housekeeper who had nursed Rosanna through the fever years before, and who climbed the cold stair, now with red eyes, and would not say at first what troubled her. It was Mrs. Pelham, in the end, who told her. The dowager had been writing to the bishop's chancellor at Talbourne. She had been gathering letters. She had spoken to Dr. Von Court, the Dunsley physician who had attended the fever, and pressed him to set down in writing that the Countess of Winford had been left, by her ordeal unfit and unsound. And the dowager had been generous, Mrs. Pelham said, twisting her apron. Generous to those who would say the useful thing. There were tenants behind on their rents who had found the arrears forgiven. There were tradesmen in Dunsley who had received the dowager's custom, and her good word. The county had always half believed the lie. The dowager was making it worth their while to believe it out loud. Rosanna sat with that a long while in the cold. She had thought herself the cause of all this, the author of the rumor. She saw now that she had only laid the kindling. The fire was the dowager's, and the dowager had foreseen everything, had paid for everything, had bought the very witnesses who would swear the marriage away. It would not collapse on its own. A thing so carefully built and so well paid for does not fall because the wronged party weeps in a cold room. So, Rosanna stopped weeping. She had been a curate's daughter before she had been a countess, and a curate's daughter knows how a parish works, knows who owes what to whom, knows that charity is a ledger kept on both sides. She rose from her chair, and she sent for Mrs. Frost, Pelham, and for Hollesley, and she began, for the first time in 4 years, to ask exactly what was happening in the county that bore her husband's name. What she learned surprised her, and the surprise was the beginning of everything. For 4 years she had believed herself a hidden thing, a shuttered absence, a woman who did nothing but wait. It was not true. Without ever leaving those shuttered rooms, she had been at work the whole time, and she had simply never looked up to see the shape of it. The winter. The fever came to Dunsley. 2 years passed. It had been Rosanna who emptied the still room and sent the cordials and the broth down to the cottages. Rosanna, who had sat up over the accounts and quietly forgiven the rents of the families who had lost their working men. Rosanna, who had written in her own hand by candlelight to every parish in the county for the receipt of a fever draft that had saved by Dr. Valancourt's own count 12 lives in Dunsley alone. She had done it, through Mrs. Pelham and through Halsey and through the rector, the Reverend Bramwell, and she had asked each of them to keep her name out of it, because a marred recluse who meddled in charity was only one more thing for the county to mock. The good she had done had gone out into Dunsley with no name on it. It had warmed a great many hands, and not one of those hands knew whose work it was. She saw it now as the dowager had never seen it. The dowager thought worth was a thing you were born holding, a name and a fortune and a fine straight back, and she thought the county would always, in the end, follow worth so defined. Yet the county was not made of dowagers. The county was made of the Dunsley women who paused in the lane of the tenants behind on their rents, of the tradesmen and the cottagers and the rector's poor box, and every one of them owed something to a woman whose name they did not know. The dowager had been buying their voices with forgiven debts and good custom. She did not understand that another hand had been quietly forgiving those same debts for years, and had asked nothing for it, and had not even let them say thank you. Rosanna did not intend to let them go on not knowing, not any more. Not to save herself. She had stopped caring about that somewhere in the cold weeks of October. To save him, she began to write letters. Not pleading letters, and not letters that named the dowager or accused anyone of anything. She had her father's parish sense, and she knew an accusation made a martyr of the accused. She wrote instead the plain accounts. She wrote to the families whose rents she had forgiven and asked them simply whether they would be willing to say so, if asked in a proper hearing before the rector and a magistrate. She wrote to Dr. Valancourt himself, the one man the dowager had leaned on hardest. And she did not beg him to recant. She only sent him, copied fair, the letters in her own hand in which she had requested the fever receipt and arranged its distribution 2 winters past. The letters that proved beyond any chancellor's doubt that the woman called unsound of mind had organized, alone, from a cold room, the relief of an entire stricken village. She sent him the dates. She sent him the names of the saved. And she let the evidence be the argument, because she had learned long ago that a fact laid plainly down outlasts any quantity of feeling laid loudly over it. The dowager learned of it, of course. A house has too many ears for such things to stay quiet, and the dowager had bought several of them. She climbed the cold stair a second time, and on this visit her soft hands were not folded and still. "You have been busy," she said. There was no water-poured slow in her voice now. "Writing your little letters, stirring up the tenants. Do you imagine a few cottagers' gratitude weighs against a chancellor's finding? You are a sentimental woman, and you have always confused being loved with being secure. They are not the same thing. I have spent 40 years learning the difference, and you have spent 4 years in a shuttered room failing to—" "You forgave their rents to buy them," Rosanna said quietly. "I forgave them because they were hungry. I think, when it is put to them plainly, they will know which of us did which, and why." For the first time, something crossed the dowager's face that was not certainty. It was there and gone in an instant, the briefest calculation. The look of a woman recounting a sum she had thought was finished and finding a figure she had not entered. Then it closed over again. "We shall see," she said, "what a county does when it must choose between its gratitude and its comfort." And she went out. And Rosanna noticed that her step on the stair was not quite as even as it had been the first time. The dowager did not yield. She did what a competent adversary does when the ground shifts, and moved the contest to ground she still controlled. There was to be a gathering at Hartcombe Court at Martinmas, a thing she had arranged weeks before under the guise of a homecoming for her nephew, the county's first invitation into the haunted house in 4 years. The neighbors would come for the chance to see it last behind the shutters, and they would find no madwoman because there would be no Rosanna. The dowager would see to that. They would find instead the gracious Lady Harrogate playing hostess, and the patient, pretty Miss Corbridge at the Earl's side, and the whole evening arranged to plant in 50 county minds the settled, comfortable picture of how things were about to be. Let the cottagers send their grateful letters after that. The county would already have seen with its own eyes the shape of the future the dowager had built. Seeing, the dowager knew, is worth a wagon-load of letters. Rosanna understood the trap precisely. To stay hidden on the night of the gathering was to let the dowager paint the picture, unopposed. To come down was to walk, scarred and shaking, into a room full of the very people who had spent 4 years deciding what she was, and to hand them the spectacle she had refused them all that while. The dowager had built a door with no safe way through it. That was her competence. That was why she had not flinched at the letters. She had already prepared the room where the letters would not matter. The black weeks came then, the lowest stretch, when Rosanna could see no road that did not end in his ruin or her own exposure, and either way the dowager won. She stopped going to the gallery window. She let the candle burn down and did not relight it. Felix came up twice, and she would not unbolt the door to him because she could not bear to have him watch or be afraid. And the not bearing was the old wound reopening, the same proud flinch that had shuttered the wing 4 years before. On the third night he did not knock. He spoke through the door, low and level, and what he said she carried with her afterward like a coal in a cold hand. "I married you in a stone church, with my whole county set against it," he said. "And I have never once regretted the cost. You decided the cost was too high for me to go on paying. You did not ask me. You have never once asked me whether I would rather have my consequence in the county or my wife. I would burn the consequence in the grate tomorrow and warm my hands at it. The only thing I have never been able to do is make you believe that. Come down on Martinmas or do not come down, only do not decide. Again, alone, in the dark, what I am willing to lose. That decision was never yours to make for me." She sat against the cold door with her scarred cheek to the wood, and she wept, finally, not in grief, but in something nearer to shame, the warm, late shame of a person who sees at last the size of her own mistake. She had thought her withdrawal a gift to him. It had been, she saw now, the one cruelty she had ever done him. She had loved him by deciding what he was allowed to keep. The dowager had merely picked up a knife that Rosanna herself had forged and set down within reach. She rose before dawn. She lit the candle. And she began, quietly, to plan how a hidden woman might walk into a lit room on her own terms and turn it. Unmasked came gray and cold, with a low sun that gilded the bare trees along the Hartcombe Lane, and by 4 o'clock the carriages were coming up 2 and 3 together, and the great front rooms of the court, shuttered to the county since the fire, blazed with candle and firelight. The dowager moved among the guests in dove-grey silk and her grandmother's diamonds, gracious and certain, and Miss Corbridge stood near the long windows in pale muslin, lovely and frightened, doing as she was told. Felix stood at the hearth with a face the county read, as cold and Rosanna would have read had she been there to read it, as a man counting the cost of every minute. The neighbors looked, as they had come to look, at the shuttered door of the east wing, which stayed shut. The poor mad creature, they murmured to one another, would not be shown. Of course she would not. There was nothing behind that door the family would ever dare to show. The door opened at 5:30. Rosanna came down the great stair alone. She wore deep green, the color of her married summer, and she had not painted over the scars or veiled them or turned the marked side from the light. She had dressed the truth plainly and brought it into the room. The talk did not stop all at once. It fell away in a slow ripple, one knot of guests at a time turning toward the stair, and by the time she reached the last step the great room was entirely silent, and 50 faces were turned up to the face the county had spent 4 years inventing. She let them look. She had decided, in the cold dawn, that she would let them look as long as they needed, and that she would not flinch, and that the not flinching was the whole of the argument. The dowager recovered first. She came forward with both hands out, and her voice poured slow and warm, all alarm and solicitude. "My dear, you are not well enough for this. Come, let me take you back up. The company will understand." No one expects, and Rosanna heard under the honey, the thing the county had been told to expect, the poor mad creature who must be gently managed back into the dark before she frightened anyone. "I am perfectly well," Rosanna said. Her voice carried. It did not shake. "I have been well for 4 years. I have simply been busy." And then she did the thing she had planned in the cold. She did not accuse the dowager. She did not so much as look at her. She turned instead to the room, to the actual people in it, and she began to name them. Not all of them. She did not need all of them. She looked to a stout farmer near the door, and said that she was glad to see him recovered, that she had grieved for his brother in the fever winter, and had been glad the broth reached the cottage in time. She looked to the wheelwright's wife and named her 3 children by name, and asked after the youngest, who had been the sickest. She looked to the Reverend Bramwell, who stood near the window with tears standing frankly in his eyes, and she said only, "You kept my name out of it, all this while, as I asked. I release you. You may tell them now whose hand the receipts were written in." The rector found his voice. He was not a clever man, but he was an honest one. In 4 years of keeping a secret he had thought a virtue came out of him in a rush. Plain and unstoppable. The fevered draught that had gone to every cottage in Dunsley, the forgiven rents, the cordials, the broth, the letters to a dozen parishes in a hand. The chancellor at Talbourne would not have to look at twice to match. All of it from the cold, east wing. All of it from the woman the county had been so comfortably told to pity, and so generously paid to forget. And the county, which the dowager had believed she had bought, turned. Not in anger. That was the thing Rosanna had counted on, the thing the dowager in all her competence had never understood. It turned in shame. The stout farmer looked at the floor. The wheelwright's wife pressed her knuckles to her mouth. A murmur went round the room, low and growing, and it was not the murmur of a county confirming a comfortable lie. It was the murmur of a county hearing, all at once, that the marred recluse it had agreed to despise had been the hand at its own sickbed all this while, and that someone had paid it to look away. The dowager's diamonds caught the firelight as she went still. The figure she had not entered in her sum had just stood up in the middle of her arithmetic, and it was a larger figure than all the forgiven rents she had bought, because it had been freely given, and it could not be unbought. Felix crossed the room. He had stood at the hearth through all of it, very still, letting his wife do the thing she had clearly come down to do, because he had learned at last not to decide for her what she was willing to risk. Now he crossed the silent floor to where she stood at the foot of the great stair, and the whole county watched him do it. And he stopped before her, and he looked at the scarred side of her face in the full blaze of 50 candles, openly, the way he had looked at her in the cold parlor by one. He took her gloved hand. He turned, with her hand in his, to face the room and his aunt and the pale, frightened girl by the window, and he said the thing he had been forbidden by his own restraint to say for 4 years, and he said it plainly, and once. This is the Countess of Wynford. There will be no other. That was all. He did not denounce his aunt. He did not shame the girl, who had been used as much as anyone in the room. He said the one true sentence the whole long lie had been built to prevent, and he said it in the very room where the county had gathered to be told the opposite, and the saying of it could not be taken back. The dowager opened her mouth. Whatever practiced, polished, hierarchy-preserving sentence had been waiting there did not come. She looked from her nephew to the marred face beside him, to the county turning slowly against her, and her composure, which was the only weapon she had ever truly owned, fragmented in front of them all. "I only," she began, and stopped. It was for the family. It was for the name. She said it twice, the name, as though the word might still buy back the room, and it did not, and she understood that it did not, and she sat down very suddenly in a chair near the fire with her grandmother's diamonds catching the light at her unsteady throat. Rosanna did not gloat. She had promised herself, in the cold dawn, that she would not. She crossed instead to the chair by the fire, and she stood before the woman who had tried to cut the marriage out of her husband, and she did the thing that undid the dowager more completely than any triumph could have. She was gentle. "You wanted to keep him safe," Rosanna said quietly. For the dowager alone beneath the murmur of the room. "So did I. We both of us decided we knew better than he did, what he could bear to lose. I was 4 years wrong. You were wrong tonight. There is no shame in it, that staying will not mend. You may stay, if you can be kind. Hardcombe has rooms enough. It was not forgiveness, quite. It was something steadier and more useful than forgiveness. An open door held by a woman who had every right to slam it, and the dowager, who had come to Hardcombe to set a marriage aside and found instead a worth her categories could not measure, bowed her straight back at last and wept into her soft folded hands, and the county, watching, saw a proud woman corrected rather than destroyed. And somehow that was the thing that turned the last of them. A destroyed villain they might have pitied, a humbled one they believed. Miss Corbridge left the next morning, and there was no cruelty in her going. Rosanna saw her at the door, the pale girl who had been promised a man and brought to a house under false pretenses. And Rosanna took her 2 hands and thanked her, plainly for her patience and her good manners through a hard visit, and told her she was a great deal too fine to be any woman's instrument. And Miss Corbridge, who had perhaps suspected as much for some weeks, climbed into the dowager's carriage with her chin a little higher than she had arrived with. The dowager went with her. She did not stay, in the end, though Rosanna had meant the offer. But she wrote, before the month was out, a short stiff letter that began with an apology, and ended with the receipt of a quince, preserve her own grandmother had used, sent up to Hardcombe for the still room, which was as near to a white flag as a woman of 60 with a straight back could bring herself to fly. Rosanna had the preserve made. It was very good. The shutters of the east wing came down before Christmas. Rosanna took them down herself, the first fine morning, with Hollesley steadying the ladder, and Mrs. Pelham crying frankly into her apron below, and the cold, clean December light came into rooms that had been dark since the spring of the fire, and lay across the old floors like something forgiven. She did not move back into the front of the house all at once. Some habits of the heart take longer to unshutter than windows. Still, she came down to dinner. She walked the frost-stiff garden on her husband's arm in full view of any Dunsley woman who cared to pause at the foot of the lane. And the Dunsley women, when they paused now, did not lean their heads together. They curtsied. One of them, the wheelwright's wife, brought up a basket of late apples to the kitchen door and would not be paid for them, and sent in only the message that the youngest was grown strong as a colt and that the family did not forget. If Rosanna's road from the dark room to the lit one moved you, sit with it a moment longer before you go. There was a night, late that winter, when Felix found her in the long gallery she had haunted for 4 years, standing at the very window where she had once watched the county decide what she was. The snow was coming down past the glass in the dark, slow and steady, and the candle in her hand laid her scarred profile and her unscarred profile both against the black pane, and she was not hiding either of them. He came and stood beside her, and did not speak for a while, and she leaned her marked cheek, for the first time in 4 years, against his shoulder, and felt him go still with the careful joy of a man afraid to startle a thing that has at last come near. "They will go on talking," she said. "The county. They will only have a different story now. Let them," he said. "It is a better story, and it is the true one." He turned his head, and in the candlelight she saw the corner of his mouth move. The first thing near to amusement she had seen in him in 4 years, treated by them both as the significant event it was, though I confess I had rather hoped you might let them go on thinking I kept a madwoman. It gave me a certain dark consequence in the neighborhood. The terrible Earl of Wenford. Now I am only a man who is very fond of his wife. It is a great calm-me-down, she laughed. The sound surprised her. In the cold gallery, in the snow light. It was the first time she had laughed aloud in that wing, and it loosened something that had been clenched 4 years, and she turned her face up to his in the candlelight. The whole of it, the marked and the unmarked, and let him look, and let herself be looked at. And the looking was no longer an ordeal, but the plainest tenderness in the world. He set the candle on the sill. He took her face in both his hands gently, the scarred cheek warm under his palm, and he bent and kissed her, soft and slow and full of 4 years of restraint, laid down at last. And outside the long window the snow came down over Hartcombe, and over Dunsley, and over the whole county that had been so sure it knew what was hidden behind the shutters, and had been so completely, so shamefully, so happily wrong. The East Wing is a child's schoolroom now, they say in Dunsley, and the Countess takes her dinner at the foot of her own table, with her face to the light. And the strangest thing of all, the thing the county still cannot quite get over, is how the marks on her seem to matter less the longer one knows her. Until after a while, one forgets to see them at all, and sees only the woman, which is, of course, exactly what her husband saw from the first, and exactly what he had waited those 4 long years for her to let the rest of the world see, too. If her long way home moved you, I am glad you stayed for the end of it. The shutters are down now, and the light is in, and they leave them open all the winter, through